The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Al Blumkin on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network for another session of David Nemec's baseball history and trivia. And today we're going to discuss the evolution of baseball rules. This is the fifth of a series that we've been doing for the last month. And our usual guest, Ian Kahanowitz, is on assignment, so today it's just David and myself. Welcome, David.
Welcome to you, Al. Pleasure to be with you again.
Same here. Okay, where do you want to start?
Well, we've covered most of the basic rule changes.
Yeah.
Last week we talked about the implementation of the foul strike rule, how it met with opposition initially. Other leagues refused to go along with the National League on it. The American League did not incorporate it until 1903, when both leagues began to play under the same rules. And in 1904, not a rule change as such, but an important change in the game occurred. Both major leagues went to a 154 game schedule, with each team meeting every other team 22 times during the season, and that lasted until expansion in 1961. Although there were some truncated seasons during World War I, 1918 and 1919 seasons were shortened because of the war. But the rules were pretty much in place by the early 1900s. There was still some juggling to do with the pitcher's mound. There were games that were forfeited because the pitcher's mound was measured out the distance from home plate and found to be short. The Cubs, in fact, forfeited a doubleheader in the early part of the 20th century because I believe it was the Giants manager, Horace Fogel, brought out a yardstick and measured it out after losing a doubleheader to the Cubs and found that the distance was short. The games had to be played over. They were actually forfeited to the Cubs or to the Giants. And but by the middle of the odd years in the 1900s, we were pretty much facing the same game that we see now. The difference being
question: why didn't 1908 in the American League, where the race was decided by half a game, why were they not required to play the full schedule?
That's a good question. That's one of the questions that nobody has ever come to a satisfactory answer to. And you would think that it would have, that alone would have changed, forced both major leagues to adopt a rule to force teams to play full schedule if the missing games were to be a factor in which team won the pennant. But that was not the case. There was no rule put in 1908 after the Indians or the Cleveland team finished. They were then called the Naps, finished half a game behind Detroit. There was no rule put in the Federal League in 1915 when the St. Louis Federal League team won more games than the Chicago team. But the Chicago team, because it had played fewer games, won the pennant on percentage points. There was still no rule as late as 1950. Now there is a rule. But it's unclear exactly when it was put in or what led to it being put in. I've gone over this with a number of authorities on the rules, and we haven't really come up with a conclusion yet as to exactly who triggered it, why it took so long to trigger. There was another pennant race in 1938 between the Pirates and the Cubs, where if the schedules had been finished, the Cubs played fewer games than the Pirates. The Pirates stood a chance of winning the pennant, but they did not play the schedule out. So that's an excellent question, and one that really bears a lot of study, future study, because there were other pennant races too during the course of the early part of the 20th century. The 1918 season, teams played an unequal number of games. Cleveland could possibly have won the pennant in 1918. Didn't happen. Schedules weren't played out.
Because the Secretary of War, I think it was, made a arbitrary final date of Labor Day.
Yeah, Labor Day.
Because of World War I. And
how many games you played, what the standings were. That was where the season ended. And the 18 season was unique in that many of the minor leagues folded. I think the International League may have been the only, at that time it was AA, not AAA, the only AA league to finish its schedule. And the Binghamton Bingos won the International League pennant. A memorable team that season, but but the important thing that we probably should get into in the early part of the 20th century that the rules had not as yet dealt with were the number of pitches that are now illegal that were allowed in the spit balls, emery balls, shine balls, cut balls. All kinds of different pitches were licorice balls, and a number of pitchers built their careers on throwing spitballs. Ed Walsh was probably one of the leading proponents. Eddie Seacott threw a shine ball. There were pitchers who threw licorice balls, and all pitchers would try to cut the ball as much as possible because balls were kept in play until they were so seriously defaced that they were almost impossible to use anymore. They would be lopsided, they would be darkened, everything, but they were not removed from play. And we should get into that definitely in this discussion. That the rule did not change until 1920, where these pitches were disallowed. Grandfathered in were all major league pitchers who did use the spitball.
Yeah, one exception though was Frank Schellenbach, who I think had pitched for the White Sox, but was not in the majors at the time.
Not in the majors, right? There were several pitchers.
The rule was grandfathered in. The pitchers were grandfathered in, and he wound up pitching the rest of his career. I think in the Pacific Coast League, where he won over 200 games.
There were other pitchers too, spitball pitchers who did not happen to be active in the majors in the 1919 season. One was Paul Wachtel, who pitched 2 games for the Dodgers in 1917. Wachtel was exclusively a spitball pitcher and had a long career in the minors, but never worked his way back to the majors, even though he had some extraordinary seasons in the Texas League. There were a number of pitchers who were buried, who really were deprived of making a living in the majors because that was their pitch, and it just wasn't legal. And
how heavily was it enforced at the big league level?
It was pretty strictly enforced. But there were, for pitchers who were spitball pitchers, they were still allowed to go to their mount. They were still stand on the mound. They can go to their mouth, do whatever they wanted. And many pitchers, because the spitball pitcher took a toll on the arm, would only fake throwing a spitball. But it was, Burley Grimes was the last spitball pitcher active in the majors. I think he finished up in 1934. So 14 years after the rule was abolishing spitballs was put into place, you still had spitball pitchers active in the majors. And it was enforced, but usually with only a warning. And I think the only time prior to recent times that a pitcher was actually thrown out of a game for throwing a spitball or being accused of throwing a spitball happened during the Second World War. I think it was Nels Potter. Potter, I believe, was with the Browns in probably in '44, and was accused by the opposition of throwing a spitball and warned by the umpire, and then ejected from the game when he seemed to persist in throwing a spitter. Whether he did or not, Potter never admitted to it, denied it, in fact. But it was an interesting thing.
Three of the ones that have been either admitted to or were accused, over the years were Preacher Rowe, who actually wrote an article for Sports Illustrated after he retired, saying that he threw a spitball. Lou Burdette and Gaylord Perry. Yeah. Yeah,
and I'm sure there were others. There were others who snuck through and got away with it and didn't admit to it.
There's a story that Whitey Ford, and there's an All-Star game out in San Francisco in 1961, and there's a very funny story that Mantle and Ford went out there and they played golf the day before the All-Star game, and they charged everything to Horace Stoneman. So they saw Stoneman the next day, and Stone said, I'll let you guys off the hook if Ford can get Willie Mays out in the All-Star game. Ford never could get Willie Mays out in the All-Star games. So the story was that there's a two-strike count, and then Ford loaded up and threw a spitter and got Mays. And Mantle was jumping up and down in center field going crazy, and nobody knew why. So that Ford was, I guess, occasionally also used. He was mostly known for supposedly cutting the ball with his wedding ring.
Yeah,
Nemec could do all sorts of things, but there's Preacher Rowe, Lou Burdette, and Gaylord Perry, who were infamously the three that I remember that were really, criticized or called out very, very high and heavy for throwing spitballs.
Yeah, Burdette was a very, very underrated pitcher. He was, I think, when he was one of the best of his time.
Yeah, he had great seasons.
He used all kinds of. He used anything he could to.
From 56 through 61, he had six really terrific seasons for the Milwaukee Braves.
Yeah, he was a really fine pitcher.
Yeah. Also, I don't know if you ever thought of this. Did any team? I know the rule that the home team had bat last was only codified in 1950. Were there any instances of home teams not batting last during the long period before that?
Nothing that I've ever seen. No, not there were still teams that would bat first in the 1800s.
Yeah.
And there was a classic game in 1890 in the Players League where the Chicago team elected to bat first at home, and their pitcher Silver King threw a no-hitter, and they lost the game because through errors behind King. I believe they lost 1-0. And King did not get credit for a no-hitter because the opposition, which I believe it was Pittsburgh, I'm not certain of that, did not bat in the ninth inning, so he did not pitch a full 9 innings. So here was a home team pitcher pitching a no-hitter.
Wow.
With it. Yeah, it was. I think it was the only one of its kind, but. And teams would elect to bat first at home for any number of reasons. Sometimes the weather, sometimes you just wanted to get a jump on a certain pitcher who was famed for not being able to get through the first inning. There were all kinds of reasons, but pretty much by the 20th century rolled around, I don't know of any specific instances where a home team elected to bat first, but it still was on the books. You could bat first. Another thing that was still on the books was the courtesy runner. If say your cleanup hitter was beaned and they wanted to keep him in the game, but he was shaky, they could bring him over to the bench and put a courtesy runner at first base, and depending on his condition after the inning, he could go out and resume his position in left field, center field, first base, wherever he was playing.
How long did that last?
That lasted till 1950. Yeah, there were instances in the late 40s where courtesy runners were still allowed. And in 1950, the rule book was gone over, and a number of things were done away with. The balk, it used to be on the balk. If a pitcher balked and he delivered the ball, there was a famous case where I think it was Nippy Jones, or I'm not clear. It may have been.
I know. I heard about Ted Klazuski.
Yeah, he hit a home run.
Home run. They called the balk, and the balk took precedence.
And he took away the home run.
Yeah.
And actually, it was one of the Mexican League pitchers. Fred, may have been Martin, or no, it may have been. It wasn't Jack. It wasn't
Lanier.
It wasn't Magley.
Max Lanier.
No, it wasn't Lanier either. It was, I believe it was a Hispanic pitcher. Yeah, I remember reading about it. It's a good story.
Yeah,
good story. And it did have an impact finally, but not till the 1950 when the rule book was finally. I don't know why it took so long for them to get around to it, but they finally did. But going back into the earlier part of the century, there still were some interesting things going on. For instance, there was no rule in effect as to how you had to run the bases. So Jiminy Schaefer,
oh yeah, he was a crazy
very
man,
colorful ball player and infielder, would start out on first base. He'd steal second because there was a runner on third. No play would be made on him for fear the runner on third would come home if there were a throw. So what Schaefer would do, the next pitch, he'd steal first, come back and steal first. And if there still was no play, he again steal second. And there was no rule against that. Finally, there was a rule put in. You had to run. You could not run the bases backward. But there were still other rule refinements that had to occur, and some of them had not an impact necessarily on pennant races, but there was a famous case, and I believe it was in 1918. Let me just try and reconstruct this. 1918, a game at Cincinnati, Crosley Field. Cincinnati center fielder Ed Roush ended up costing himself the 1918 batting title. This game took place in April, and Roush was playing center field, and there was a ball hit to deep center with a runner on third. The Cards were playing the Reds, and Cardinals runner on third, Bert Niehoff, on a deep fly ball to Roush, thought assumed he could score in the deep fly as soon as it was caught, tagged up, and Roush stumbled as he went to catch the ball, and the ball bounced out of his glove, and as he was falling, he managed to spear it. Well, Niehoff had taken off as soon as the ball touched Roush's glove, and scored. The Reds protested, and Heine Groh, who was playing third base, called for the ball, tagged third base, and the umpire, Hall of Fame umpire, Hank O'Day, declared Niehoff out. And the rule was very fuzzy then. And the rule said the runner can tag as soon as the ball settles into a fielder's hands, a fly ball.
So it wasn't as soon as it was touched.
Hands. Settles into meant, could be interpreted as O'Day did, that it had to actually be caught, firmly caught and held. And the protest was upheld. And Roush had gotten 2 hits in that game, and the game was thrown out. And as a result, Zach Wheat, who was also involved in a protested game that year that was thrown out, won the batting title, even though Roush, if the protested games had not gone through, Roush would have won the batting title. He cost himself the batting title, as it turned out, unintentionally, of course. And
basically, there was no provision to resume at the point of the protest.
No. A protested game had to be played over from scratch. And that was true of rained out games. It's true of suspended games. You did not pick up from where the action left off.
I know rained out games are always, they passed a rule not too many years ago where the Yankees were playing in Baltimore and losing 3-0. They got 5 runs in the top of the 8th, and then the game was called in the bottom. And they reverted to the previous inning, and they changed that rule a bunch of years ago.
They did.
Well, if the visiting team goes ahead, the bottom inning has to be complete. They treat it as if it's past its 5th inning, they treat it as a suspended game, not a rain out. If it is a situation like that, but that took forever to get changed.
Yeah, that was really quite a recent rule change, all considered. Yeah, but there were still games in the early part of the 20th century and there were some famous, the famous umpires then. The most famous umpire was Bill Clem. Another Hall of Fame umpire was Tom Conley, and of course O'Day is now in the Hall of Fame. These 3 umpires, O'Day, Conley, and Clem, were involved in an awful lot of protested and forfeited games, considering that they were viewed to be among the best umpires, if not the best, of their time. Conley, in particular, was constantly being embroiled in games that had to be played over, or there were all kinds of confusion. They were protested, forfeited, usually for players batting out of turn, runners passing runners on the bases. There was finally, in the early part of the 20th century, a 2-umpire system was put into place in both leagues. But 2 umpires, 1 base umpire and 1 home plate umpire, were really not enough to see all that was going on in the field. And finally, by the 1920s, they went to a 3-umpire system. And then, of course, they went to a 4-umpire system. But that really wasn't until firmly until the 1940s. And the idea of having umpires on the lines, as happens now in postseason play. That was done actually in the earlier days, but they would put the umpires on the lines and not on the bases, where they might have an umpire calling the right field line, the left field line. They would still only have 1 base umpire, so there would be 4 umpires in some World Series games, not every one, but there would only be 1 umpire in the bases and 1 umpire doing the play. So it really wasn't too helpful because there were seldom very many controversial calls. The reason they were put on the lines was because one thing that did not exist as yet and was taken for granted now is the foul pole. So umpires were left on their own when a ball went into the stands on the left field line or right field line. Their judgment was required, and it wasn't always right as to whether the ball was fair or foul when it went over a wall or a fence. And
wasn't there a famous case in the Polo Grounds? I think Harry Danning hit one, and the Giants, it was called foul, and the Giants went crazy.
Yeah, there were a number of games that were protested for that reason. In the early part of the century, just on a fair foul, whether the ball was fair or foul. The umpires didn't always agree. The base umpire would say it was fair. The plate umpire thought it was foul. They would confer. And usually the senior umpire, whether he was working the plate or the bases that day, would win out. and that would cause all kinds of controversies too.
Yeah, when did they get rid of the home run bouncing into the stands?
That's a good, another good point.
Yeah.
American League got rid of it in 1928, but the National League didn't get rid of it till 1931. And the last home run that bounced into the stands was hit by a Hall of Famer who didn't make it as a player, but made it for his managing, and that was Al Lopez. I believe he was catching then for the Braves, and hit a one bounce shot to left field in Ebbets Field, and it bounced over the fence and the wall in Ebbets Field, and that was the last one bounce home run.
Was there a
one
study
thing
of?
you did see, you saw in there, and you still saw it late at the teens, were balls that went through. Marty Cavanaugh hit a grand slam pinch homer. I think it was 1915. That was actually a hot shot to the outfield, and it skipped through a hole in the fence. And because the umpires couldn't determine for sure that it had gone through the hole, there were only two of them. They had to give them a home run, because any ball that went over the fence on one hop, two hops, three hops, whatever, was considered a home run then. It didn't have to be a one hop. It could bounce 3 or 4 times before it went over.
Were there any records kept on this? Oh,
yeah, there are. They're pretty arcane. I don't know where. I'm probably RetroSheet. If you look on RetroSheet, you might be able to find. You definitely can find inside the park home runs.
Yeah, I know.
Whether they have balls that bounce into the stands or not, I'm not sure.
No,
they also have a record of home runs that were not counted as home runs, because it used to be that you could not win a walk-off game by more than one run.
Yeah, that I know.
So if the score was 4-4 and the bases were loaded, and you put one in the left field seats, you got credit for a single. If the runner from third came home to score, you got first base. That was it.
And when was that?
That was done away with.
When was that changed?
That changed about the same time the one bounce, thing that changed. But there, Babe Ruth lost home runs. Many early day sluggers lost home runs to the rule, and those home runs have not been reinstated. There was a record of them. I think even in the very first encyclopedia in 1969. I haven't gone through that again.
Maybe Tassel, who started the home run log, and White David.
Yeah, he did an amazing job. And
White David Vincent, he passed
through heavily on him.
Yeah, he passed away last year, David Vincent.
Yeah, that was a very, very tragic.
Yeah, and I don't know if anybody's keeping that up at this point.
Not the way David did. No, David also kept records on umpires. Impeccable records, and it's a huge loss. So there were the rules. Really, the rules we see today, for the most part, were in place by the early part of the 20th century, but not entirely. And certainly the rules on protested games and so forth were not in place, because there's only been one successful protested game really I think it's about the last 30 or 35 years, and that was recently, just a couple of years ago, where they had a pickup play from where the protest went.
What about the Pine Tar game?
Fly.
That was
the Pine Tar game. Yeah, that's another game. That was that's over 30 years ago now.
So that was 1983.
That was one of the last games that was successfully protested, and that was resumed from the point where it occurred. Yeah, because the rule was put into place that protested games did resume at the point where the protest was lodged. But that was probably the most, in our lifetime, probably the most famous protested game. I happened to be watching that game, and it was crazy. It was crazy.
Yeah, Brett got a little upset. In fact, there's a story in sports.
He had to be restrained.
Yeah, Brett didn't get married or have kids until after he retired. And there was a story in, I think it was either Sports Illustrated or Sports Collector's Digest, that when his oldest son got to be 6 or 7 years old, he would say, let's see the tape where Daddy got mad. Yeah, that's when he came home.
Oh yeah, I remember him storming back out in the field after he rounded the bases. And I think he came right out of the dugout. He just came charging out of the dugout.
Oh yeah.
That was.
They made up. Excuse me. They made up something about the spirit of the rule or something like that because his bat did exceed the pine tar limit.
Yeah, the pine tar definitely was illegal. Yeah. And the Yankees, it was interesting. They could have gone either way. I thought the decision could have gone either way. McPhail, I think he made the correct decision in the end, but it was interesting because the Yankees usually got the benefit of those kinds of calls earlier on in protested games.
I remember reading about a protested game between the Dodgers and the Pirates where one of the teams, I forget who it was, brought in some pitcher and he didn't pitch to one batter.
Right.
Which was a pitcher by the name of Hank Berman.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I forget which side he was on.
He was with Brooklyn. Brooklyn.
They brought him in. He didn't pitch to one batter. They took him out. There was no injury or whatever, but there have been cases, I think, with Robin Yount's older brother, Larry.
Yeah.
They brought him in to pitch, and he hurt his arm warming up.
He was listed to start the game. Actually, he hurt himself in warm-ups, and they pulled him. And there was.
He never pitched. He never was in a major league lineup after that. Yeah.
No, he wasn't. That was a real fluky
but
thing.
Basically, from the ending of the spitball pitches in 1934, legal ones, basically it's been pretty stable since then.
It has. There are still some rule refinements, and every once in a while you see a play that sends the umpires scurrying to confer because it's one they've never seen before. And were you watching the 2005 ALCS when was it Krasinski struck out?
Yeah.
And, that was a classic. That I'd never seen before, anything like it. And I'm still convinced that I'm not convinced that I think the White Sox ended up winning the World Series because
they swept them in Houston.
Yeah,
they swept Houston 4 games.
They would have been down against the Angels.
Oh, in the LCS,
I think.
Yeah, the LCS.
In the LCS.
Back in the good old days where there was no division rounds. Yeah.
Yeah. That was.
Yeah. Okay, I think we've covered it. Next week, I'd like to get into scheduling because that's been an interest of mine for a very, very long time, especially not the way they schedule now, but the development of scheduling and all the adjustments they had to make.
Yeah, we could take that back into
expansion
the first National League season,
yeah.
1876, and even before that, because there were no official schedules issued prior to the seasons in the early years, and how teams went about scheduling. It was interesting. It was fascinating. In fact, that's a good
topic.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to
forward to that.
I want to thank you. I hope everybody who's been listening to this series has enjoyed it and has a better understanding of how things have changed over the years I want to thank you, David. David wrote a book a number of years ago called about baseball rules, which is excellent. I recommend it to everybody.
Did one on forfeits and protested games, too.
Yeah, and one that came out 2 years ago on forfeits and protested games. And I want to thank you, David. You're a fountain of information on this stuff.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I really enjoy this. You and I have some great times here.
Oh, yeah. So, again, I want to thank everybody, listening audience, and we'll see you next week. Take care, everybody. Okay, David?
Okay.
Bye-bye.